this episode, we have David Reinstein and Bob Kubinak telling us a bit about the Unjournal and their take on the publication process. Welcome to Allegedly Doesn't Replicate, a podcast by the Institute for Replication, where we put research to the test again.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm here joined with, of course, Abel. And we have two very special guests today, David Reinstein and Bob Kubinak, both from the Journal. And Bob joins us also from the University of South Carolina. I think this is going to be a very interesting podcast. I'm talking about open science, about the Unjournal project, but I'll let them introduce themselves and tell us a bit about how they came up with the idea and how the Unjournal works. David, Bob, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thanks for having us. Yeah, so I'm the director or co-director of the Unjournal and the founder of the Unjournal, coming out of 20 or more years in academic economics, then at an effective altruism-aligned think tank, and also working on some independent projects. So you sort of asked me before the call, what led you to the open science arena? What led you to start the Unjournal? And I don't like to tell, I feel like expo stories are often very much constructed to make a nice narrative to, hey, how did I get here? But I think I could say something that's both coherent and I think true. So when I was in academia, and then later when I was in this sort of effective altruism impact aligned think tank, I saw what I think is a synergy and a coincidence of wants, sort of the baker baking the bread. And who's the other person on the other side of that story? I've already forgotten. The tailor, I think. So there's research users, people who are actually using this research, making funding decisions, making policy decisions, that actually cared about the impact of the research and the credibility of the research, and had funding to support it. At the same time, academics were stuck in a system that I think most people agree is not perfect. It's inefficient. It's better than, it's better than not having peer review at all, but it could be vastly improved. So it also came out of my frustrations in academia to some extent. I mean, my gravitation towards open science, I noticed that in doing the research, I'm sort of treading old ground and preaching to the choir here, but through my job market, they call it the job market paper in economics, there were definitely opportunities to be opportunistic and lazy in ways that would actually increase my chances. So, part of the way through the paper, I was using an instrumental variables approach, and I realized that the way I coded the data was wrong. When I went through it again, the instrument was no longer particularly powerful. But, there was a lot of pressure. If I had been lazy, I could have said, well, I'll just stick with the original code, right? But also then, as an economist at teaching and doing research in England for about 15 years, I realized there was a lot more discussions of how to get into journals and what editors at which journals are publishing what stuff and what you should do to make yourself pretty for the journals, where you should present seminars. And then even at those seminars, very often people don't respond to your paper. They say, okay, you should pitch this as a this. Right? So everyone aiming at this beauty contest. And then also when you're reading papers, particularly as a graduate student, maybe when you read the most papers, but also through your research career on the methodology and trying to compare yourself to other work, place yourself in the literature, you often found things that were not explained or things that were clearly had a mistake in them, or you talked to people and they said, oh yeah, I would fix that now. But I already got this into QJE, so I can't do anything about it. I also realized that there's now these great, like what we call open science friendly dynamic formats, Quarto notebooks, the multiverse dashboards, where you can even display these as sort of someone could pick all the analyses you could have done. You could hover the notes. You could link to the pre-analysis plan. All the code and data can be there, and you can continually improve these research projects. And I wanted to use these in my own research and in my own sort of research synthesis, but there's no quite way to submit them to journals. It sort of brought me to the conclusion that the journal publication as the output is hindering us in many ways, both in terms of doing the best science, doing the most transparent science, having the right incentives, sharing the communications. And it's a system that I think, anyways, I'm giving you the whole pitch now, I'm sorry, but everyone complains about it. And if you're going to start it from scratch, you'd never say, hey, how are we going to get the best, incentivize, evaluate, filter the best research in economics and other areas? You wouldn't say, all right, well, let's start 50 journals with sort of random names, different requirements. They're going to be sometimes under paywalls. The editorial decision is going to be vague. Yes, you'll get peer reviews, but you can't, sometimes they're very detailed, but you can't do anything with them. You'd come up with some sort of evaluation system. Okay. So people in academia, I think, generally agree with it, but they say, okay, but I'm in academia. I can't start some new thing. It's going to be a lot of work. I also can't jump outside the system. I left academia, to at least to a certain extent. I felt that I had this opportunity to maybe make some change in a way that would benefit groups on both sides, the users of the research, the producers of the research. And I felt like I had some more freedom to do that. And then I got some funding and grants. And now we're sort of pushing forward with it. And I think we've shown a decent proof of concept. Anyways, I think I'm talking a bit too long, but the main thing about me is that when people complain about something, but they don't do anything about it, it drives me absolutely crazy, which might be my own neurosis. But, that's what makes me think, all right, well, let's just do something. Let's put our money where our mouth is to a certain extent. Anyways, I guess that was a sort of rambling anecdote, but I think that gives you a sense of how I got to where I am now.
Yeah, David, this is fascinating, and we'll get Bob to tell his story as well in a second. But one thing I find fascinating about what you just said is some of the things that you were not happy about with the current system have been around forever, whereas other things are sort of new. Now we're using a lot of data, and there's a lot of decisions that are made about like how you should present the data, coding errors, things like this. So I think the conversation is quite interesting because I can see why some of your critiques are quite relevant for what's happening now, but not necessarily what was happening like 50 years ago or 100 years ago. Right? Some of the critiques are, why do we have this system from the beginning? And now we're stuck in sort of an equilibrium where it's really hard to actually move and try to deviate from it, especially at just as a researcher yourself, it's really hard to deviate from this because where are you going to publish? What are you going to do? So it's interesting to see that you sort of got out of academia and now are thinking of it from like an outsider to some extent. An insider, you've been inside academia, you did a PhD, you had your job market paper, and so you've been both inside and outside policymakers, talking to people who are interested in what we do. Right. So I think
being on a whatever the UK's equivalent of tenure track, and then being a senior lecturer I did realize those, and I gave in to some extent to some of those pressures. I did work on papers that I thought, well, this is the other side of the Unjournal, but particularly I worked on some papers that I thought, this paper is really interesting. To me, it has a lot of, people are saying it has potential to publish in a decent journal, but I don't actually see the impact of this paper. I don't see what the actual, it's hard for me to say that this is the paper that's going to change the world, vastly improve human welfare, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, now, right. So I don't have those same incentives right now. So hopefully I can do things, bring people in, maybe help change the incentives for people who are in the system.
Yeah, that's great. Bob, we want your story as well. So how did you get into open science and how did you get involved with the Unjournal?
Yeah, fun. It's interesting. Actually, a few people have really asked me that question. I think for me, well, I went into science after working in government, specifically in the U.S. State Department, which is the equivalent of the Foreign Affairs Ministry. And it was actually being censored, having stuff I'd written be censored in that environment for political reasons, as they do, was one of the drivers for me going into academia in the first place. So I've always, from the get-go, I've always had this sort of belief and desire to, have that, the big strength of science was the ability to publish things without fear of retaliation, based on evidence, et cetera, et cetera. I think that that's a really common belief. And I'm still an optimist. I still think science has so much to offer, even with all of the frustrations that David mentioned. Personally, I think that science, the modern day, scientific community has so much going for it, especially as, so many other institutions like media become increasingly polarized, fragmented. We still have the independence to write, to publish. It's an enormous gift. And I think that, starting when I first started sending out papers in graduate school, it's really clear that, our publication system, essentially we're handicapping ourselves. We're taking our biggest strength and we're wasting it because, I think a combination of inertia and this is how we've always done things. But then I think too that both Dave and I think kind of share a background in economics, political economy. There's a lot of incentives at play. And one thing that I don't think there is enough awareness or discussion of in the open science movement, or certainly in kind of the research side, is awareness that we can change people's beliefs or ideas. We can convince people the system is broken, but the system will go on because it serves a function, it serves a purpose. And the primary component of that purpose is hierarchies and prestige hierarchies, right? In some sense, the fact that the system is broken is a feature, not a bug, because it becomes so difficult to publish that by the time you actually do it, people are just sort of astonished, right? Like, oh my gosh, you got this out. And then we use those, that we make these resources scarce so that we can then distribute other resources, essentially jobs, promotions, grants. And so, it's just like screwing with the money supply. We don't really want to mess with this stuff because it would upset these values, these hierarchies that we use, right, to do the business of science. And so that's why for a long time I believed that for there to be actual change, we need research, we need advocacy, all that stuff is important. We also need new institutions, right? And so that's what really got me into Unjournal, was just the belief that until we start creating institutions, nothing's really going to change, because we have to change the incentives. We have to provide other avenues for publication that work for people. And we have to demonstrate it. I think, as David said, Unjournal, I think he's being a little modest in terms of proof of concept. It's already done a lot of really credible reviews, making things public. There's a lot more work to do, but I think this is the type of thing that's really necessary. And so, for me, I'm kind of at the end of the tenure track, and I love being involved in Unjournal because it's something that is actually doing. Maybe I share David's concern, like it's actually doing something. And there are days, and we all have them, when we see the brokenness of the publication system. Your R&R comes back rejected after 6 months of work. Your article is desk rejected because it didn't have a catchy title. Whatever dumb thing happens, and we know that that's not how it should be. And I think being able to contribute, and I don't contribute nearly as much as David does, but be able to contribute to something that's actually making a difference, to me, that that's something that helps me really sustain my career.
That's so interesting. But let me ask you something. As someone who is not very familiar with the Unjournal, what is the Unjournal? Give us your elevator pitch for it.
That's a great idea. That's a great idea. So, just basically what we do is we change the model in a certain way. Okay, we do what the value of journals is. Basically, the idea is, what is the value of journals? Right? Journals are not really so important for dissemination. There's actually a lot better formats for dissemination than journals. We have in economics, everyone puts their working papers up, and a lot of people actually have formats that are better than working papers they'd love to put up, like quarto-dynamic documents. The value of journals is peer review. It's evaluation, and that's what we do. We do evaluation. And I think, if you want to point to something that we could say the most tangible thing that we have definitely done is we've done about 32 evaluations, or we've commissioned 32 evaluations of research and made those public. And basically, we're the only place you can go to find sort of high quality, what you might call referee reports online, open to the public. So that's at unjournal.pubpub.org.
But these papers are published or they're not published?
Well, it depends what you mean by published, okay? So in the economics term, we generally are targeting, let me see if I can find the page where I have the sort of the process here. So this gets to be a bit much. Sorry, maybe I shouldn't try to handle too many things at the same time.
Yeah, it's fine. I think you can just explain it.
So basically, we're focusing on, let's say, largely, a lot of the work we've evaluated has been NBER working papers. So it's in economics, people put up their working papers online. In other cases, something similar is called preprints, and they present these around for years while they're going through trying to get them into traditional journals. We are mostly evaluating these papers, this research, before it's been accepted in a peer-reviewed journal. Although in some cases we have evaluated things after they're accepted in a peer-reviewed journal, to some extent, particularly that's more important in other fields like psychology, where the peer review process is much quicker. Okay, so basically what we're doing is people can submit their work to us, and we'd encourage people to submit their work to us, but we also look for work that's most impactful in a certain sense, right? So we have a remit in terms of our funding and our goals to focus on research that you can say has a clear case for direct impact on things that affect global welfare, human survival. So not sort of deeply theoretical at the top of the pipeline research, but research in areas often global health and development, for instance. Pandemic prevention that could inform policy and decisions that could be super impactful, or maybe are just one step removed from that. Like it's a method that people will use in assessing how do we consider happiness measures. So researchers can submit their work, or we just go out there and select work that's out there, seems impactful. We contact the researchers. If they're junior scholars, we'll ask them their permission. Otherwise, we'll just ask them for their engagement. Then first, before we reach out to them, people on our team suggest research. We have a system for prioritizing that research. We vote on it. Then we assign an evaluation manager, which is kind of has the role of an editor. Contact the authors, ask them, do they want any particular feedback? Are there things we should know about? Or do they want a sort of embargo, et cetera, et cetera? Then we have an evaluation managers. And then we have the evaluation managers, we actually pay the reviewers. We call them evaluators, because we're not rejecting a paper. We're giving a quantitative and descriptive, asking them to give a quantitative and descriptive evaluation of that research. So we pay an average of about $400 to $450, but we have all sorts of incentives and prizes. And then we don't publish the research, for what publishing means. We're not claiming ownership of the research. We're linking the research, and we're publishing and trying to make as prominent as possible the evaluation package, including an author's response and potentially including the evaluation manager's synthesis.
Okay, so
yeah, go ahead.
Could I ask? So the way it works is you select work, so no one submits your work to you. You just go and select the work.
No, we encourage people to submit, right? But in this process of change, it's been hard to get, we're getting more, but it's been hard to get people to submit their work because kind of no one wants to be the first to jump in.
I know what you mean.
So our thought was we're going to focus on evaluating work that people see as high prestige to sort of establish that this is something that a group you'd want to be a part of.
I see.
But if you submit your work, or you engage with us, you're also eligible for particular prizes. We offer impactful research prizes. We're very incentive driven.
Okay, I see what you mean. So at the end of the day, what happens is everything gets published, quote unquote, published, and it's very transparent for readers to assess the quality of research based on what evaluators and evaluator managers say and write about that research.
That's right. So We're going to update this a bit, but basically, not only do we ask the evaluators to write, we give them some guidelines. We say, okay, here's some things you might want to focus on. We want you to also focus on impact and credibility more so than cleverness, because we're a little bit, whatever, opinionated in a certain sense, but we still want this to be like of the quality of a referee report for a top journal or top field journal, and not even of the generic quality of the best ones. We want them to write detailed, substantive referee reports or evaluations. But we also ask them, and we pay them, to do these structured evaluations. And if you're looking at my screen, you see a little glance of the sort of things we ask here. We say, okay, give an overall assessment. How much does it contribute to advancing knowledge and practice? How strong are the methods? We're also now introducing something. What is the most impactful claim the paper makes, and how much do you believe that claim? And what robustness checks would make you believe the claim more? And we also ask people to state think of this tier of journals for economics. We give it for other fields as well. And we say, okay, let's say the first tier is top 5, maybe plus a few. Second tier are these top field journals and general interest journals, et cetera, et cetera. Where do you predict this paper will be published? So we have something that, we get some feedback loop on, but also if politics and everything was no barrier, if things were done in a meaningful way, where do you think this paper should be published? But then for all the metrics, we also say, where does this paper rate in terms of percentile relative to, I think it's papers you've read in the last 2 years in this area. So we ask for these quantified metrics and we report them prominently. So the idea being that we want this, since we're not a journal with a journal tier, we want this to have a very tangible value, or to have the possibility of having a tangible value for careers, for people who might want to judge and filter and say, I only want to read research that people predict will get in a top tier or second tier journal. And for careers, for people who want to filter research, or to decide which research to evaluate. And we're going to be able to, sorry, I lost the third point I was going to make on that. I'm sorry. Maybe it'll come back to me.
It's fine. David, Bob, this all sounds extremely interesting, but I wonder, how are traditional journals taking research that has already been quote unquote published in the Unjournal? If I'm a researcher and I love your project and your idea and I want to be part of it, but I also have, I don't know, I have to meet 10-year requirements and I have to make progress towards it, can I still send my paper to a traditional journal after it has been published in the Unjournal?
Yeah. So again, the paper is not published. We're just doing evaluations. And as you say, you don't even have to submit it to us. We might just evaluate it anyways, which is a good sign. It suggests that people think your research has the potential for impact, right? So you can submit peer review. There's I've looked at this carefully. There should be nothing, at least in all of the economics journals, that if we've evaluated, that shouldn't be any impediment to your submitting it to any journal of any tier. Now, what you're saying gets at the point that I was trying to get to, which is, I'd like our evaluations to be taken one way that I think that we can have an impact and sort of start to be considered seriously as part of the process is, I want our evaluations to be considered, in this intermediate stage by the gatekeepers, by grant funders, maybe by journal referees. We're going to make them visible and seen by them before they evaluate their paper. But now, and that gets to, of course, you're going to say, well, then why would authors want to submit their work to the Unjournal? The idea, I have a whole discussion about that in our frequently asked questions, but the idea is, one, you get to respond to these critiques in ways you don't at traditional journals. Now, there's some journals that allow you to submit the referee reports from one journal to another, but it's a bit imperfect. You can respond to these critiques by engaging, and particularly by submitting your research. You're making a statement. I'm saying I'm open to being critiqued. I have confidence in my research. That itself should update people's beliefs about the credibility of your work. But also, if, you might think, okay, well, I'm being undervalued in some sense. I'm not at a top institution. My work's falling a bit below the the radar by getting, I think the evaluation is likely to be more positive than people would have thought from the outside. That might give me the chance to then get into a higher journal than I would have. Now, that said, we'll get to this later. I don't see journals, as I alluded to, as being the ultimate goal. I see continuous evaluation and improvement in an open way as being the best state of research. But I'm realistic, and I know that people you have to link to metrics people are used to. The idea kind of is we're going to give measures and evaluations that have value and that are hopefully predictive of journal outcomes or of ultimate impact and credibility of research. At a certain point, the fiat money replaces actually having to hold the goal. So that's the sort of long-term theory of change, if you like.
One question I have maybe for Bob and for you, David, would be a lot of what you're saying sounds a lot like the PLOS One journal or some journals that basically what they do is, look, we care about the methodology. We care about, is it well executed? We don't care too much about contribution to literature. I mean, replications are important. If you're not the first one to do something, so what?
Yeah, I agree with that idea for the most part.
But I think one thing that, and even the Unjournal is quite provocative. Clearly, you're trying to move away from journals, and your critique is more, I would say, more general. And here you decided that instead of launching a journal that would just publish evaluations that people can respond and everything is just open, everybody can look at it, and you give a score. So everything that you're doing, instead of giving this a publication, you've decided, no, let's not do that. Let's do all of it, but this is not a publication. People can still go ahead and actually submit this to a journal, submit their paper to a journal, maybe also with the evaluation. Maybe we save time. Maybe the editor might want to just ask for one refer report instead of two. But why did you decide to do this? Maybe Bob wants to jump in. Why not just doing another journal that pretty much just cares about the execution and the methodology?
Well, as someone who has published in PLOS One, I think I can answer that. I'd say one of the biggest differences between us and PLOS One is that we don't charge like $5,000 in article processing charges. And yeah, I mean, that's another big barrier for people. As David mentioned, we're using modern publishing techniques like you can submit. We don't really care how you submit your article to us and go through all these loopy, journal formatting stuff. But that's an important barrier to consider. But what we're doing is a little bit different. And one way to think about it is we're not doing post-publication review, we're doing pre-publication review, right? As David mentioned, yeah, our aim is to make the papers better. We're not here...
That's part of our aim, let's say.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is we're not... there are other people out there like Elizabeth Beek, for example, who's like searching through papers for, fraudulent cancer images, right, of like tumors and stuff. And that's not what we're really doing. We're trying to really make the whole process better of getting your paper out there. And even PLOS One, it doesn't have necessarily a ton of barriers, but it's not particularly transparent necessarily how they make decisions. And they also have a financial interest in publishing as many papers as possible, right? So that's another sort of perverse incentive that we really don't have. We're actually paying reviewers to review the piece. So we're trying to get high quality reviews, that really go deep into your paper. And I will say that a lot, I think there's a kind of David, mentioned this. So people are kind of hesitant. It's like, well, why would I put my paper out there and have it critiqued? But the reality is, maybe you're not going to submit your worst work or, a paper, has big flaws. and maybe that's okay, right? Like it encourages people to do their best work. But also, I mean, evaluations that we've put out there have really generally been quite positive, very constructive. Do they sometimes bring up problems, et cetera? Yes, they do, but they also take the work very seriously. I mean, we are paying them to do that. And I think, as David said, you then have, as he's showing here on the screen, you have some of these documents, very thorough reviews of your paper. And I think those are fantastic for tenure cases and other things. Some of that process you don't get to see and can really boost your file. I'd say too, what we haven't talked about, and one thing that I really advocate with this project is for reviewers. So one, we pay reviewers, like the only project that tries to do that. And second, we publish the reviews, and it's up to the reviewer whether or not they want to use their name. Personally, I encourage them to do it because then they get a publication out of it. I did one last year and it's on my CV. I mean, I think that's worth quite a bit. Now, does that mean reviewers are probably a bit nicer if they put their name on it than if they don't? Yes, but I also think that's a feature, not a bug, because we've all gotten those awful reviews from people who, are dismissive or rude or simply not taking the paper seriously. And, we want the reviews to really be constructive. So I think it's really a better equilibrium. But, as David said, we're still in the early stages. Unjournal becoming its own, alternative to the publication system, I think that is a goal and it's possible, right? At present, we're trying to fit into the broader publication system, but maybe in ways that subtly undermine it over the long term.
I mean, if I could just add a couple things to that, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you were asking how we're different than PLOS One. I mean, and I've gone through and I've looked at the different initiatives in this space of evaluation separate from publication or linked to some sort of publication but made to public evaluation. So there are some good initiatives in biology and life sciences, but there's little to nothing in economics and social science, particularly where it's done seriously, where they asked for sort of people to make a judgment about the quality or the credibility of usefulness of the paper, where they insist on detailed evaluation. I call them evaluations, but you're going to keep calling them reviews because that's what you're used to. And I'm sorry to be a stickler for that. And, if you're looking to find public evaluations of economics research or research in the social sciences, but especially economics, I think we're kind of the only game in town. But getting to the difference between PLOS is a journal, right? We're not a journal. If you get your paper published in PLOS, I can't remember if they have some sort of tier system. Do they? I don't think so. But in any case, quote unquote, the limit to the credibility or the value of that paper is you got a paper into a PLOS, right? Which we know that, let's be honest, people sneer at that a little bit. You can't get tenure at Harvard with sadly, right? You can't get tenure at Harvard with an Unjournal evaluation, at least, not yet. I'm thinking well, but the point is that with us, the sky is the limit, right? Because we're evaluating your paper. If you get really strong evaluations, there's a certain sense in which, in a potential future world, that could be even better than getting a paper into a top journal in economics. Because, even within economics, top journals, there's a spectrum of how useful and credible and innovative, interesting is the work. So the fact that we are rating and evaluating the work, again, submitted in any format or posted in any format, it could be a dynamic document, I think that separates us from the traditional things that are leaning much closer to the traditional model like PLOS. And yes, the fact that these organizations are generally sucking money out and we're putting money in, I mean, yes, that is, certainly good, more than just on the margins, I would say.
David, Bob, this all sounds super interesting. How does the pipeline work? Looks like how many papers, I don't know how to call them, like how many papers have you worked on? How many evaluations have you received? Tell a bit about the numbers of it. How does it look?
Right. So we have received, maybe only a dozen or so submissions, generally from people who are really connected to some of the organizations and groups that we're concerned with at the moment. But people on our team, we've sort of have in fact, you can even see it if you look at our database of the research that we're considering. We've prioritized a few hundred papers, right? Here's the database. You can sort it by different categories. You can see where it is in our pipeline, and then I guess 100 at the moment that are sort of active in a certain sense. We've commissioned evaluations of about 30, getting to be a bit more papers, with generally about 2 evaluations each, and you can see those at, as I said, unjournal.pubpub.org, but you can also see the data dashboard. You could focus on particular areas. You could look at particularly evaluations we thought were particularly high value. And then we have another dozen or so in the pipeline. We're looking to scale up while still maintaining a certain amount of quality, I would say. Does that answer your question, Juan? Sorry, I don't know if I went off.
No, it does.
So
It does.
yeah,
One thing
one
that
thing I
so,
yeah, go for it. No, so one thing I was gonna ask is, imagine I send my paper for evaluation. How long does it take before I actually get the evaluation? And does this delay the moment where I could actually submit to a journal, or would you even encourage people maybe to at the same time submit to a journal? Or
I certainly wouldn't discourage that. I would not discourage that, right? That's not a terrible thing. So you can submit to us. And by the way, we're looking at coming up with we're thinking about building and working on building some other ways you can get feedback even after you've submitted to us, like through chat bots where people can query the paper. But that's just teasing an initiative I think could have a lot of value. So you submit your paper to us. I think if you submit it to us, we're going to also prioritize it a bit more because we're trying to encourage submissions. Now, the timeline, I have to take a closer look at, what our turnaround times have been. I think they're about between 2 and 6 months. The difference is, though, at a journal, once you wait that 6 months, sometimes even a year, you have something back which might have absolutely zero career value to you, right? When you get something back from the Unjournal, you're getting a public evaluation that should have some credibility to it. People have, it could be anonymous evaluators, and there you have the advantage of people maybe being a little more willing to tell it like it is, or you might have someone putting their name on an evaluation saying this is likely to publish in a second or first tier field journal, and here's why. Right, so you actually have something to it at the end of those 6 months, and as you say, you could have also been submitting to a traditional journal in the meantime. That shouldn't be a barrier to us.
Yeah, so I guess this is really exciting, I think, and hopefully you're getting more submissions over time. I mean, I could see a lot of people being interested in submitting, and people were thinking that their paper is really good, especially if they can submit the journal at the same time, maybe aiming really high, and meanwhile, while you're even expecting the rejection, and a lot of people like to try too high at the beginning. So I don't think necessarily you would like waste time in parentheses.
Right. I mean, and this gets at the model that we're hoping to go for, where you're not sitting there thinking, I have to play this gaming strategy with journals, right? But yeah, go on.
But I guess this leads me to like a bigger picture like question. Imagine this is like a resounding success. You guys are scaling up like crazy. How does this change the landscape? Or more generally, like, not necessarily in a perfect world, but imagine you could restart the publication system. You can restart how research is being done and disseminated. What does it look like? Like in a perfect scenario for you? Does it look like the Unjournal, but like many, many different Unjournals for each subfield? and people submit papers there, they get evaluations, everything is open source, open, like you get all the reports, all the data, everything is out there with these reports. Does it look like this, or do we still have the journals, but most papers go through before something like the Unjournal? What does it look like?
I mean, I can tell you what I see as the research utopia of sorts, right? And Bob, you probably have your own ideas about it. So I think, first of all, yeah, we don't need journals. That's an antiquated institution. They're definitely providing some value in terms of the peer review, but that, we don't need printing things and putting them on the shelves. I think that evaluation is the future, and I'm not quite arrogant enough to say it's definitely going to be the Unjournal that's going to be the one doing it. I think we have a good approach. I think we're off to a good start, where I think we're emphasizing good things. I think maybe in a utopia, there'll be more than one evaluation system, right, that have different approaches that are sort of competing and keeping each other in line in a certain sense. More than one, there's two credit agencies. Maybe that's not the best example, but you see what I'm saying, right? But I think that evaluation will replace getting your paper into a journal. I think that's got to happen. It's just so much value there. We're playing a stag hunt, and we're hunting, the bunny that we're hunting is getting so small relative to the stag that's out there. And so I think that evaluation will replace publication. I also think evaluation will be dynamic in a certain sense. And I think that, this gets at some of the things that Brian Nosek's trying to do, and others in computer science are doing, or at least moving towards pretty well. There's this AlphaKive thing. The idea is, many people really working on a few strains of research their whole career, and they have to keep folding it, salami slicing into new papers. They figure out a better way to do it. They have to claim it's a new paper, right? You should just be working on the research, and the credibility of your research will be evaluated continuously. If someone finds a major limitation to your research, well, that'll be a down rating of the credibility of your research. If people start using it, if you improve it, well, that can uprate it. So what you eat for your career and how your research is judged should be based on, something having to do with the current evaluations of the existing body of your research, as well as the way they're used. What form should the research take? I'm going to say it should not be PDFs. All right. I mean, PDFs obviously have some value when I'm trying to read them on my e-reader, but I think it's going to be websites. It's going to be explanations that you can link to, that can open up to help the PhD student reading it, to go into detail for the people that particularly want to know about this particular property of the estimator, not to have to put it in a 400-page appendix. But actually also, when you think about it, it's probably going to, and this is maybe going a little bit off piece, but it's probably going to involve chat as well. So you put up your research, people will be asking questions of your research, right? You'll get feedback on those questions, and you will prepare answers and extra materials to help answer questions and anticipate questions about your research. But, but basically, yeah, I think it's going to be evaluation, and I don't think it's going to be PDFs. Does that, but maybe, Bob, maybe you have a different perspective on it.
A very sophisticated Rotten and Tomatoes, but for papers.
That's fair.
Way more sophisticated.
That's fair.
Yeah.
David,
well, I think, go ahead, Juan, sorry.
No. Finish your point. I'll ask the questions later.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just making a pitch for people to be involved here. I mean, it really is exciting. Some of the stuff David's talking about. I mean, Unjournal, we're being realistic. We're not going to change the publication system overnight, but there's actual progress being made here. And I can say as a volunteer, looking at, you see these slides, they really have done a ton of work. I think there's a lot of proposals, right, for how to change these systems. You can see there's a decent number of articles that are very well written. There are not as many real efforts. And there's been some actual progress here. And we have the infrastructure both they've really kind of developed it, and it works. And personally, what do I think will happen in what would I like to see happen in the future? What I'd like to see is something like Unjournal that's collectively funded by universities. So instead of paying, and this is already happening, you're seeing it a bit with universities, rejecting Elsevier contracts and pooling resources. But something like Unjournal that's, in place of the ridiculous article processing charges and all this nonsense, they fund a big, archive like this. I mean, we already have them, right, for, posting preprints, but something that can handle all the journal feedback. We have people who, I don't think editors are going away. I don't think they're bad, right? And that's what Dave was saying. This is an evaluation system. We're not saying evaluation is bad, just that we can handle it much more efficiently and in ways that encourage feedback to be incorporated into articles instead of just used as like a binary prestige filter or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so that's the world I'd like to get to. I don't think that's really impossible. I do think if we transition to this system, it would undermine some hierarchies. And frankly, as a political economist, whenever there are valuable resources at stake, there's going to be pushback. And I think that it could undermine some of the hierarchies people have built. I have only top 3 publications, but at the same time, using this system, it's actually very clear, when you have a quality article, right? When people can see the reviews, when they can see the feedback and discussions, it's just going to be, less of these games that David talked about of trying to guess the editor, connect to the editor, meet them at a conference, use your advisor's connection to blah, blah, blah. Hopefully less of that and hopefully more real science. That's my hope.
Yeah, that's the goal. One of the key goals is to try to move incentives towards people actually doing better research and more useful research.
So, a question for people who are interested: how do they join? Either as people who want to submit their research or as evaluators, how do they make part of it? How do they become part of it?
This is a great idea. And by the way, I just wanted to say, Rob is a volunteer. We pay. Our approach is to pay people for their time at modest, but I think reasonable rates as a show of good faith and a show that we're really serious in valuing their time. There's definitely a few ways you can get involved, and we'd like to have people get involved. I'd also like to make an appeal to journal editors to reach out to me. I'd love to discuss how would you consider if a paper had been, evaluated in the Unjournal? How would you consider engaging with this? Another big source of value, we're looking to ask people who've done referee reports for journals to potentially make those public and share those, because a lot of part of the value is unlocking this knowledge that is, of the process of, but that probably to some extent has to be done in tangent with the journal editors, or at least would help to have their endorsement. I went a little off topic there. So
can you say more about that? Why is having journals like BMJ releasing referee report, even without the names of the referee, let's say, why is this important? Why does that matter? How does this help you? But in general, why do you think it matters that we actually see reviews?
I mean, I think it of tremendous value for, well, there's a few things. One is it's of high value for other researchers to know, okay, what is the conversation like? And if you're outside of the, sort of a Harvard MIT sphere or Stanford Berkeley sphere, I threw Berkeley in there, sorry, because I'm from there, so I wanted to. But if you're outside of those circles, it might be hard to be really part of understanding that conversation. And that will improve research. I think it also, by forcing people, not forcing, okay.
Wait. I need to push back here.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
You just said it's going to improve research. And so far what you've said is it would decrease potentially the comparative advantage of people who are in specific zip codes who have access to that information.
But not decrease not decrease their access to the information, and just make that information available to others.
No, I know, but they lose a comparative advantage of having that information which other researchers don't have. But I would push back on the idea that it's going to make research better necessarily. You could imagine that actually, instead of having a couple of researchers in specific zip codes playing the game, now everybody is going to start trying to play the game, because what the referees are going to be interested in, what they're going to say,
Yeah, but the things, I mean, if they're making this feedback public, right? This is the other point, that you're definitely a little bit more encouraged to not just say something that's beauty contesty, to say,
This
I
I
think
agree.
that I
This I
think that these
agree.
other people wouldn't like this. You're forced to, not forced, but encouraged to make more substantive comments. And that's the idea, to have these substantive comments shared and come to the fore. And I think that, yeah, that'll increase the knowledge, but also improve the dialogue, let's say. But that was meant to be an aside. I'm sorry for going off in these asides,
No,
but
please.
I'm very interested in senior people, not just senior people, but if senior people want to potentially, we could use more people to be part of this effort, to endorse this, to support it. And I think if you wanted to ask who should submit their research to be evaluated by the Unjournal, I think you could make a very strong case that actually it's the people who have a chaired professorship that have little to lose. They want to get public feedback on their research. They want to support new initiatives that are having an impact. Then, they want to get feedback without necessarily going through so much of the journal dance. Those are the people that should be stepping forward, both to support this and to submit their own work, because they're not, facing those risks in a sense.
Yeah. And if I could chime in there, and David, I don't know how we're sharing the podcast. You have, yeah, I guess you got your links here, but we have signups to submit papers we've been talking about. We also have signups to be an evaluator. And one thing I would love to see come out of this project is for more evaluation where people attach their names to it. Or at minimum, I mean, we're talking about, there's definite value to the scientific record. I mean, every review that's written is a piece of knowledge, right? It's its own work. Most of those are just lost. I know Nature Human Behavior, some other journals are publishing them. I'm sure you've had articles. I've had articles with tremendous reviews, right?
Yeah.
Where people thoughtful, and that information, that knowledge should not be lost. But I would love, and I really encourage people who do evaluations to attach their name to it. They're not required to. You're free to do it anonymously. But it's sort of my thing. I think hopefully in the future, we can, right now, all the reviewing that you do is sort of quote unquote service, right? It's not part of your CV. You don't get rewarded for it. We have like the Publons thing, or like some weird credit thing that hasn't done much. It would be amazing to, I think, have people do book reviews and attach their name to it. And somehow that's not like crazy and, everything. But, what if, you could have reviews on your CV and people could say, wow, this person's a really good reviewer. That should be a valued trait for scientists.
Yeah.
And we can actually, reward people for that. So I think, I encourage people who are listening to this, maybe you don't have a paper that's ready for Unjournal, but sign up for the evaluation thing. You can get some credit. They have a great publication system. Okay, it's not publication, but posting it online, and you get some money.
I think that's
the money is the 400
No.
bucks on average is like, if you're an assistant professor, like just to finish paying the bills and things like this, 400 bucks is a lot of money.
And we're working to try to actually even increase this, because we know that $400 is a lot of money for some people. For a lot of people, it's not a lot of money. We want to make this part of the attraction for everyone. I agree with Bob that there's a lot of value in signing your reviews, but I also see a lot of value in anonymous reviews. And we've had some definitely discussions about the pros and cons of each. So yeah, so how can you get involved? So you can just follow this link. It tells you how to get it, the different ways you could get involved, bit.ly join UJ team. And then ultimately it'll take you to a form that allows you to say, here's the different ways I'd like to get involved, and we'll reach out to you. And basically the main ways we want people to get involved are, join the evaluation pool, so that we'll ask evaluators even if they're not in our evaluation pool, but if you're in our evaluation pool, you'll be the first people to reach out to because we know you're sympathetic, and you'll share some of your expertise, so it saves us a step. You can suggest research for us to evaluate. You can submit your own research and potentially specify conditions on that. You can also join our team, our field specialist team, help us prioritize research. And I think this can be a good opportunity for people, even in the early stages of their career, even students on our field specialist team. Basically, they're going to be helping us find research that has the potential for impact and make a case for that. They're not going to necessarily be the ones. That process isn't particularly about judging the quality of the research. So you don't necessarily have to have a lot of technical expertise to be part of that prioritization process. So yeah, so there's quite a number of ways you can engage. You can also just we have a new thing called independent evaluation, and sort of our main mode is we're identifying experts and managing the evaluation. But maybe you want to build your portfolio. You can do an independent evaluation and share it with us and be eligible for a prize. We're also looking to cultivate relationships with universities, with events. So, for example, if you're at a university that has a reading group or a journal club, we might be interested in working with you to turn the output of that journal club into public evaluations. We can offer some incentives, we can offer some guidelines, and mainly we can give a target for that, a use for that output that you're producing as part of your journal club or reading group.
Yeah. Let
Thanks,
me
Bo. This is
chime
great.
in.
And yeah, please, Bob. Yeah, no,
Just to say,
please
chime
jump
in
in.
here for one very practical thing. So I did my first evaluation for Unjournal last year. I saw it pop up on one of the screens David had. So I love the paper. I also gave it an honest review. And then there's a political scientist who was mentioned the paper on social media and was like, "Hey, I'm going to teach this in my graduate seminar on development." And I was like, "Great, well, read my review of this paper, right?"
Award-winning
And
review.
it was really, thank you, but it was really useful for him, right, to have that review and to have that be part of the conversation about the paper. So, just a very small practical thing of like how making these things public actually helps us to, do better science.
Who can join? Like, if I'm a grad student, like a 4-year on my PhD, can I join as a reviewer?
You can join our evaluator pool. By the way, just to be noted, Bob was not on our team at the time he won the prize. He joined afterwards. Just to be fair, we're concerned about those issues. So as a graduate student, you can definitely join our evaluator pool, particularly a PhD student. And PhD students, often have a lot more knowledge about specific methodological issues than senior professors who've been in the areas at the time. I would say most of our evaluator pool currently either has a PhD or is in a PhD program, but we're not credentialists. It's not an absolute requirement. If you can demonstrate, your research and your research evaluation in other ways, that's also acceptable. And we have had fairly senior people doing the evaluations as well, some of them leaving their names. So it's more or less all levels to join the evaluator pool, I would say.
The reason I ask is because oftentimes you see grad students, especially PhD students, wanting to get referee invitations, right? Invitations to do referee reports. And this is a great opportunity for them to not only put themselves out there, but also to get an experience on how this whole thing works and improve a very cool initiative. So I was just
I agree. I think this could also work well with assignments. Well, we're happy to work. We're happy to work with people doing teaching in research programs to encourage you to say, here's some things we'd like independent evaluations of. Also, if your students are particularly strong, you can recommend them to us, or they can show us their work and we'll reach out to them. I think it has a lot of value. There might be there's this idea that people at the early stages of their careers need to be afraid to have their name out there or to be seen, and they can't be critical of anyone. We'll definitely support anonymity there if it's a value, but also, I want to kind of shift the narrative towards a world that has, we might say, good epistemics or a good culture of constructive criticism, where You're not criticizing the researcher, and criticism is actually of value to you. It's a compliment in a certain sense.
And the reports are positive. Like, it's not like you're going to completely trash someone's work. And I think, I relate to a lot of what you're saying, both of you, because most of the reproducers that we have at the Institute are actually putting their names on these reports. And they do it because they do it in good faith. The report is not super positive, super negative. It just states facts. And then you engage in a dialogue with the original authors. I think most people are actually okay putting their name on something they've done.
I think that's right. And I just reminds me, I haven't mentioned it, but I think these early evaluations, particularly when we ask people to say, do they provide replicability or replication content? What aspects of the paper do you think are not, or of the claims do you think are a little bit less well defended, and what robustness checks are relevant? I think that could feed into this, your model where people do actually later kick the tires on the paper's data itself.
For sure.
David, Bob, this has been an amazing conversation. So
Thanks.
interesting. Thank you for being here. I just wanted to give you the opportunity to make any last comments before we go, because I didn't look at the time, but we're over the hour.
Sorry about that.
No, but that happens
fun.
when the conversation is interesting, and so that's always good. So, any last comments?
I mean, I'll just. Well, Bob, why don't you go first if you have anything to say?
Sure. Well, I want to say first, I just want to highlight, David and his work. He's been just absolutely throwing himself into this project. He's done a ton of work on it. Doing this is not easy. It's easy to, complain. And I just think him and his team are just doing tremendous work for science. And he's not someone who maybe gets all the credit for it, but I think this is a really great project. And, he's really throwing himself into it. And I appreciate everything he's doing. And I think that the last comment I would make is the best, right now, this is, as I mentioned before, it's like a pre-publication review system. So probably how it's mostly different from the reproducibility stuff, which is fantastic. I love it. Because there's sort of this assumption at the moment that, you would send your paper our way and then have it reviewed, and then it would end up in a traditional journal. Of course, as we mentioned, like, we'd love in the future to have this, like, to have your article be a living record. That would be the goal. Obviously, that will, that's a bigger goal, and one that would require a lot more work to achieve. But for now, we're basically providing an incredible service that can help you make your paper awesome, or as a reviewer to do, or evaluator to do, to get some credit for the work that you do.
Thanks, Bob. If I could just say one or two small things before we wrap up. Thanks. So this is my main job. I'm working on this basically full time, and I have a grant funding to do this. Get modest. So I'm always eager if people want to reach out to me to ask me questions about it. If they see, oh, this variation could work, we could extend it to this area. I'm open to those opportunities and supporting those opportunities with our platform, with our system, with what we've built. But yeah, basically, I just encourage people to see what we have to offer, see if it's useful to them in the research community, also in the research users, and go to unjournal.org and the links within, and consider, whether you want to get involved. Go to our knowledge base, ask questions of it. But if you have any doubts, just reach out to me. So that's it. And I really want to thank Abel and Juan for having us on the podcast, and I really love the replication initiative agenda and the replication games. It's amazing what you're able to do. I've participated in one plus an online one, and I really think, again, it's great that someone's finally doing this.
Thanks for the compliments, and thanks both of you for being in the podcast. Really appreciate.
All right. It was a pleasure.
All right, everyone.
Absolutely. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Fun conversation.